People really like to compare America to Canada. Well, at least Canadians do. And usually the differences that are brought up are just ways for Canadians to feel all smug and superior to the US. Here are a few differences that you might actually find interesting. America has a lot more people than Canada, almost 10 times in fact. Everyone obviously knows this on some level, but citing specific numbers can help put the difference in sharper focus. There are 35 million people in Canada. That is fewer than the number of Americans who live in the state of California alone. It is also fewer than the number of Black Americans, and fewer than the number of Americans who claim to suffer from irritable bowel syndrome. Some of the smaller regions of Canada are almost comically tiny when you compare them to the US. For example, the combined population of Canada's 3 northern territories could fit in the University of Michigan's football stadium. Canada is actually a larger country than the United States in terms of physical size, but it's also a lot more empty. In America, there are 35 people for every square kilometer of land. In Canada, the number is 4. This is because most of Canada is a terrible frozen desert that no one can use for anything. In America, 44% of the country's land is used for farming and crops. In Canada, that number is a measly 7%. Most Canadians live smushed up against the US border, while Americans are distributed a little bit more evenly across their country. If you ever look at one of those world at night photos, you'll see this pretty clearly. Canada is a much whiter country than America. Whites only comprise about 62% of America's population, whereas in Canada it is closer to 80%. Though both countries are getting a lot less white thanks to immigration, Canada's white population isn't expected to shrink to US levels until the 2030s, according to the Canadian census. And by that point, whites in America will be closer to 50%. Despite being more racially diverse, America actually has fewer immigrants as a share of the national population than Canada. About 14% of Americans were born outside of the United States. In Canada, that number is closer to 20%. But wait, you say, how can a country with so many immigrants still be so white? Well, it all comes down to where those immigrants come from. Around 7% of Canadians were born in Europe, compared to only 2% of Americans. It is pretty well known that Canada has a lower crime rate than the United States, although it is not as dramatic as some people like to imagine. There is one crime, however, where Canadians consistently outperform Americans, and that's arson. In 2014, the most recent year for which we have data, Canadians committed 24 acts of arson per 100,000 people, compared to only 14 in the US. This gap has been consistently wide for decades, and no one really has a good explanation for it. Though it does explain why Canadian history seems to be full of stories of things burning down all the time. My theory is that because Canada is so cold, it makes people want to seek refuge in the beautiful warmth that only fire can provide. Sweet, beautiful fire. So those are a couple of hopefully non-stereotypical differences between Canada and the US. I've spent a lot of my life talking about these two countries, and as much as possible, I like to try to talk about them from a non-stereotypical perspective. There are differences to be sure, but the differences aren't always political, and they're not always what you might expect. Do you have any good examples of non-cliched differences between the US and Canada? Let me know, and if they're any good, I can start a giant fire. I mean, make a good follow-up video.